In 1843, a photograph was taken at an isolated plantation in the interior of South Carolina. The image showed three young white women dressed in fine silks, seated with aristocratic posture, while three black girls, identified in the records as family servants, stood behind them. For over 170 years, that photograph remained stored in a cedar trunk, passed down through generations as an innocent portrait of plantation life. But in 2015, when descendants of the three families decided to take DNA tests out of genealogical curiosity, the truth emerged from the shadows. All six girls shared the same father. The secret the photograph held was not just about forbidden kinship, but about an elaborate system of control, silencing, and erasure. The plantation master, Benjamin Harlow, had maintained forced relationships with three different enslaved women, fathering daughters who grew up under the same roof, but in completely opposite worlds. While his white daughters were educated in French and piano, his black daughters worked in the fields in the big house, forbidden even from looking directly at the sisters they never knew they had. Official records from the era mention only the three legitimate daughters in wills and property documents. The other three girls appear listed as property in the same documents, valued alongside horses and furniture. But letters discovered in 2018, hidden in the walls of an old plantation chapel, revealed that Benjamin's wife, Eleanor Harlow, knew everything. More than knowing, she had orchestrated a pact of silence with the enslaved mothers, promising better living conditions in exchange for absolute secrecy and eternal submission. The local community always whispered about uncomfortable similarities between the girls. Neighbors commented in hushed voices about identical eyes and the same dimple on the chin, but no one dared question publicly. Asking questions about kinship on plantations was inviting violence. Silence was the currency of survival. When the truth finally came to light through DNA analysis conducted by descendants curious about their origins, the discovery shook three entire families. White descendants of the Harlows confronted a heritage their ancestors had buried under layers of lies and falsified documents. Black descendants finally found explanation for stories whispered by great-grandmothers about mixed blood and forbidden glances. The 1843 photograph, once seen as a relic of a distant era, became evidence of a silenced crime, the deliberate erasure of the humanity and kinship of three girls who were property before being recognized as daughters. This is the story of six sisters, separated by the color line, reunited by the truth of DNA, and of the generations who carried this secret buried in the foundations of slave-holding America. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the bell. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. Chapter 1. The Forgotten Photograph. 182 years ago, at an isolated plantation in the interior of South Carolina, a daguerreotype photograph was taken by an itinerant photographer passing through the region. The image captured six girls in front of the big house of Harlow Plantation, three seated in mahogany chairs wearing imported silk dresses, three standing behind them, wearing simple raw cotton dresses. Records from the time identified the seated girls as Catherine, Elizabeth, and Margaret Harlow, daughters of owner Benjamin Harlow. The three standing girls were listed only as family servants, with no full names recorded. The photograph remained stored for generations, passed from mother to daughter in the Harlow family as a nostalgic portrait of an era considered more elegant by white descendants. No one questioned why those six girls appeared to be so close in age, or why they shared such similar facial features. The official narrative was simple: kind ladies posing with their young employees. The truth, as often happens in plantation stories, was buried under layers of intentional silence and manipulated records. In 2015, a descendant of the Harlow family named Rebecca Montgomery found the photograph while cleaning the attic of her recently deceased grandmother's house. Rebecca, a history teacher in Charleston, was immediately intrigued by the image. The six girls appeared to be between 8 and 12 years old, and something about the photograph's composition bothered her. It wasn't just the power dynamic evident in body posture, but something more subtle: the way all six girls' eyes seemed to share the same almond shape, the same discreet dimple on the left chin. Rebecca began researching in county historical archives. Records from 1843 listed Benjamin Harlow as the owner of 87 enslaved people. Among them, three women named Sarah, Louisa, and Hannah appeared mentioned in inventories as trusted domestic servants, a designation that generally meant access to the big house and proximity to the master's family. The births of Benjamin's white daughters were meticulously recorded. Catherine was born in 1831, Elizabeth in 1833, Margaret in 1835. But birth records of enslaved people were practically non-existent, listed only as property increase in the plantation's account books. The more Rebecca investigated, the more questions arose. She found wills in which Benjamin Harlow left generous portions of land and money to his 3 legitimate daughters. In the same document, 3 enslaved girls were listed as property to be divided among the heirs. The recorded names were incomplete. Sarah's girl, Louisa's girl, Hannah's girl, identified only by their mothers' names. The practice was common. Enslaved people rarely had registered surnames, and children were often identified only by maternal lineage, as if fathers didn't exist. Rebecca shared her discoveries in an online genealogy forum, seeking information about descendants of the enslaved families from Harlow Plantation. The response came from an unexpected place: a woman named Angela Foster, descendant of a black family that carried oral histories about connections to the Harlows. Angela had grown up hearing her great-grandmother tell that the family had Harlow blood, but always assumed it was just another story of sexual abuse and slavery, too common to be considered special or worthy of formal investigation. When Angela saw the photograph Rebecca had posted, something clicked. Her great-grandmother had a similar photograph, passed through generations, showing one of the standing girls, the one identified as Sarah's girl in the records. Angela's family always knew their ancestor had worked in the Harlow Big House, but details were vague, buried under decades of protective silence. Speaking openly about mixed kinship during slavery, and even after it, was dangerous. It could bring violence, could reopen wounds, could expose vulnerabilities that black families couldn't afford to show. Rebecca and Angela began exchanging information. Soon, another descendant joined the conversation, Patricia Owens, whose family records also mentioned enslaved ancestors at Harlow Plantation. The 3 women, separated by skin color but connected by a common past, decided to take DNA tests. None of them expected the result that came in January 2016. The test revealed that Rebecca, Angela, and Patricia were 3rd-degree relatives, second cousins, to be exact. Moreover, they shared significant segments of autosomal DNA indicating recent common ancestry. Genealogical analysis indicated that all 3 descended from the same man from the 1830-1840 generation. When they triangulated the data with documented family trees, there was only one possible explanation. Benjamin Harlow was their common ancestor. The 6 girls in the 1843 photograph weren't just young ladies and servants. They were blood sisters, separated by the color line that defined everything in slaveholding America. The 3 seated girls were raised as heirs. The 3 standing girls were property, but all shared the same father, and that photograph was the only visual evidence of a truth that 3 families spent 170 years hiding. The discovery was just the beginning. As Rebecca, Angela, and Patricia began unearthing forgotten documents and confronting carefully constructed family stories, they realized the secret was much larger and more deliberate than they imagined. It wasn't just that Benjamin Harlow had fathered daughters with enslaved women. That was tragically common. The real secret was that his wife, Eleanor Harlow, knew everything from the beginning and had orchestrated an elaborate system to ensure the truth never came to light. Chapter 2. The Master and His Shadows. Benjamin Harlow inherited the plantation in 1828 at age 26, when his father died of yellow fever. Records from the time describe him as an educated man, graduated in law from the College of Charleston, but who preferred rural life to urban advocacy. He married Eleanor Pemberton in 1829, a strategic union between 2 landowning families. Eleanor brought as dowry 20 enslaved people and 3,000 acres of land adjacent to the Harlow property. Documents preserved in county archives show that Benjamin administered the plantation with calculated efficiency. His account books, discovered in 2017 during renovations at the old Big House, reveal a man obsessed with control and profit maximization. Every barrel of tobacco, every pound of cotton, every birth and death among enslaved people was meticulously recorded. But between the pages of cold numbers there were notes suggesting something more sinister, references to special arrangements with certain women, extra provisions of fabric and food destined for specific rooms in the slave quarters. Sarah arrived at Harlow Plantation in 1829, part of Eleanor's dowry. She was 16 years old and worked as a seamstress. Louisa had already been on the property since childhood, daughter of a woman enslaved by Benjamin's father. Hannah was purchased at a Charleston auction in 1830. brought specifically to work in the big house due to her experience as a lady's maid. The three women were young, skilled, and isolated from their families of origin, the perfect targets for a master who viewed enslaved women not as human beings, but as extensions of his property to be used as he pleased. Court records discovered in 2019 revealed that Benjamin had a reputation in the county as a fair but firm plantation owner. Neighbors described him as educated and refined, a man who attended church every Sunday and contributed to local charities. But depositions from a lawsuit filed in 1851, long after the events we're examining, mentioned rumors about Benjamin's peculiar arrangements with certain enslaved women. The case was quickly dismissed, and the documents were sealed for decades under pressure from the Harlow family's lawyers. What made Benjamin different from many other slaveholding men who fathered children with enslaved women wasn't the act itself, that was horrifyingly common, but the systematic way he organized these relationships. Based on letters found hidden in the plantation chapel's walls, it appears Benjamin maintained separate arrangements with Sarah, Louisa, and Hannah simultaneously, each woman believing she had some form of special status that would protect her and her children. Sarah gave birth to a daughter in 1832, just months after Catherine Harlow was born to Eleanor. The baby, never given a legal surname, was listed in the plantation records only as Sarah's girl. Louisa gave birth to a daughter in 1834, shortly after Elizabeth Harlow's birth. Hannah's daughter was born in 1836 following Margaret Harlow's arrival. The pattern was unmistakable. Each of Benjamin's enslaved daughters was born within months of each legitimate white daughter, as if he were creating parallel families under the same roof. Testimonies from descendants, collected during interviews conducted between 2016 and 2020, revealed family stories passed down orally for generations. Angela Foster's great-grandmother used to say that Sarah was treated different. She had her own small cabin near the big house, received fabric for dresses twice a year, and her daughter was never sent to work in the fields. Patricia Owen's family carried similar stories about Louisa, who worked exclusively in the kitchen and whose daughter was taught to read in secret, a dangerous and illegal practice in South Carolina at the time. But the most disturbing revelation came from letters Eleanor Harlow wrote to her sister in Charleston, discovered in a private collection in 2018. In a letter dated March 1837, Eleanor wrote, "My husband's indiscretions are known to me, and I have made arrangements to ensure they cause no scandal. The children born of these unions will be raised within their proper station, and their mothers understand the consequences of speaking out of turn. I have promised them certain comforts in exchange for absolute silence, and they have accepted these terms. It is an imperfect solution, but one that preserves our family's reputation." Eleanor wasn't a victim ignorant of her husband's actions. She was an active architect of the system that kept these relationships hidden. She provided the enslaved mothers with just enough comfort to ensure their cooperation. Better food, lighter work, the promise that their daughters wouldn't be sold away, while making it clear that any attempt to reveal the truth would result in brutal punishment or separation from their children. The three enslaved mothers lived in an impossible situation. They could refuse Benjamin's advances and face being sold, beaten, or having any existing children taken away. They could comply silently and hope for some measure of protection, or they could speak out and face not just their own punishment, but the certainty that their daughters would suffer for their mother's defiance. It wasn't a choice. It was survival under conditions designed to leave no room for resistance. Benjamin maintained this system for years, visiting each woman's cabin at night, fathering daughters who grew up knowing they had siblings they could never acknowledge. The white daughters, Catherine, Elizabeth, and Margaret, were raised in luxury, educated by tutors, preparing for marriages to wealthy men from neighboring counties. The black daughters, never given legal surnames, identified only by their mothers' names, worked in the house and gardens, forbidden from speaking unless spoken to, trained to serve the very sisters they would never be allowed to claim. Court documents from the 1840s show that Benjamin increased his wealth significantly during this period. The plantation produced record harvests, and he purchased additional enslaved people to expand operations. To the outside world, he was a successful gentleman farmer with a respectable family. Only those living in the slave quarters knew the truth, and they understood that speaking that truth could mean death. The silence was enforced not just by Benjamin's power, but by Eleanor's calculated manipulation. She visited the slave quarters regularly, checking on the three mothers and their daughters with the pretense of Christian charity. But according to oral histories preserved by descendants, these visits were subtle reminders of who held power. Eleanor would compliment the girls on their appearance, noting how much they resembled, and then pause, letting the implication hang in the air before moving on. She would inquire about their health, their training, their behavior, always with the underlying message that their comfortable conditions depended on continued silence. By 1843, when the photograph was taken, the system was firmly established. 6 girls, ages ranging from 8 to 12, all sharing the same father but living in parallel universes, separated by race. The photograph captured them in their designated roles, 3 seated in silk, 3 standing in cotton. Benjamin likely commissioned the photograph as a record of his family, though only 3 of his daughters would be acknowledged as such in any legal document. What Benjamin and Eleanor couldn't have anticipated was that truth has a way of surviving even the most elaborate systems of erasure. The photograph they took to celebrate their family would become, 172 years later, the key piece of evidence that would finally expose the secret they spent so much effort hiding. Chapter 3. Sisters in Silence. The 3 enslaved daughters grew up in an impossible reality. They lived in the big house, worked alongside their white half-sisters, and were forbidden from acknowledging the blood connection they could see reflected in mirrors and in each other's faces. Sarah's daughter, Louisa's daughter, and Hannah's daughter, never given legal surnames to distinguish them as individuals, shared more than a father. They shared the burden of a secret that could never be spoken. Oral histories collected from their descendants between 2016 and 2025 pieced together fragments of their daily lives. Sarah's daughter worked primarily as a lady's maid, helping Catherine dress each morning, arranging her hair, and attending to her needs throughout the day. The irony was cruel. She fastened the silk dresses on her sister's body while wearing rough cotton herself. Louisa's daughter assisted in the kitchen and dining room, serving meals to Elizabeth and Margaret, standing silent and invisible as her half-sisters discussed books and social events she would never be allowed to attend. Hannah's daughter worked in the gardens and helped with cleaning, often passing her white sisters in hallways where eye contact was forbidden. The white daughters, Catherine, Elizabeth, and Margaret, grew up entirely unaware of the truth. To them, the 3 enslaved girls who worked in their home were simply servants, part of the household property they'd been taught not to question or consider too deeply. Education in slaveholding families deliberately cultivated this blindness. Young white women were raised to see enslaved people as fundamentally different, incapable of the same emotions or family bonds that white people experienced. The possibility that the girl braiding their hair each morning might be their sister was literally unthinkable within the framework they'd been taught. But there were moments when the truth nearly surfaced. Angela Foster's great-grandmother passed down a story about an incident in 1844, when Catherine was practicing piano in the parlor, and Sarah's daughter was cleaning nearby. Catherine made a mistake in the piece and laughed at herself, and Sarah's daughter, who had listened to Catherine practice for years and had memorized every piece, instinctively hummed the correct notes. Catherine turned, surprised, and for a moment looked directly at the girl with curiosity. Eleanor appeared in the doorway instantly, as if she'd been waiting for exactly such a moment. She sent Sarah's daughter to work in the fields for the rest of the day, a clear message about the consequences of stepping out of assigned roles. The 1843 photograph itself reveals the psychology of this system. If you examine the image closely, and descendants have studied it extensively, you can see subtle details that tell a deeper story. The 3 white daughters sit with shoulders back, hands folded comfortably, expressions confident and direct toward the camera. The 3 black daughters stand with shoulders slightly hunched, hands clasped tightly in front of their bodies, eyes not quite meeting the lens. Their posture isn't natural submission, it's learned behavior, the result of years of training in how enslaved people were expected to present themselves around white people. But look closer at their faces. Despite the positioning and different clothing, despite one group seated and the other standing, despite the color line that divided them, the facial structure is remarkably similar. The same almond-shaped eyes, the same slight dimple on the left chin, the same curve of the brow. Anyone looking at the photograph with neutral eyes could see the family resemblance. But in 1843, South Carolina, no one was looking with neutral eyes. The possibility that Master's legitimate daughters and enslaved girls could be sisters was literally invisible within the racist framework of the time. Sarah, Louisa, and Hannah, the 3 mothers, lived with the knowledge that their daughters were growing up alongside sisters they could never acknowledge. Court testimonies from an 1852 property dispute, discovered in 2021 during digitization of county records, included a deposition from a former overseer, who mentioned that the three women kept to themselves and seemed to share an understanding. They had formed their own quiet support network, bound by the shared experience of raising children fathered by the same man, under the watchful control of his wife. The mothers taught their daughters survival strategies passed through generations of enslaved women. Never look white people directly in the eyes. Never speak unless spoken to. Never show anger, even when treated with cruelty. Never reveal what you know. These lessons were delivered gently, usually late at night in the small cabins where they lived, whispered warnings that could save a life. But they also taught something else, something that couldn't be spoken directly. Remember who you are. Remember where you came from. Remember that you are more than what they tell you. Descendants of the three enslaved daughters, preserved fragments of family stories that suggest the girls developed their own secret communication. Patricia Owen's grandmother told her that her ancestors used to leave small objects for each other, a smooth stone in a particular spot, a flower arrangement with specific meanings, subtle signs that said, "I see you, and you are not alone." These gestures had to be invisible to white observers, but among themselves created a language of connection that no amount of forced separation could completely erase. The system Eleanor had established depended on silence, but silence creates its own pressures. By the late 1840s, Benjamin's health began declining. He developed a persistent cough and lost weight steadily. Doctors diagnosed consumption, tuberculosis, a death sentence in the 1840s. As Benjamin weakened, the question of what would happen after his death loomed over everyone in the plantation. Now I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach. Eleanor began making arrangements. She consulted with the family lawyer, a man named Harrison Caldwell, whose firm had represented the Harlows for 2 generations. Letters between Eleanor and Caldwell, found in a Charleston law office's storage in 2020, revealed the cold calculations behind her planning. She was determined to protect her legitimate daughter's inheritance and reputation. That meant ensuring the 3 enslaved daughters, and their knowledge, would never threaten the family's standing. Caldwell advised Eleanor to sell the 3 enslaved daughters to buyers far from South Carolina, separating them not just from their mothers, but from any trace of their origins. Eleanor initially agreed, but Sarah, Louisa, and Hannah discovered the plan. In an act of desperate courage, Sarah confronted Eleanor directly, something that could have resulted in brutal punishment or death. According to family stories preserved by Angela Foster's line, Sarah told Eleanor, "If you separate us from our children, I will tell everyone whose daughters they really are. I will go to every plantation in this county, to every church, to every court, and I will tell them what happened in this house." It was the most dangerous thing an enslaved woman could do. But Sarah understood that Eleanor's greatest fear wasn't just scandal. It was the permanent destruction of her daughter's marriage prospects and social standing. If the truth became public knowledge, no respectable family would allow their sons to marry Catherine, Elizabeth, or Margaret. The stain of acknowledged black half-sisters would make the white daughters unmarriageable within their social class. Eleanor backed down. She and Sarah reached a new, even more sinister agreement. The 3 enslaved daughters would not be sold away. They would remain at Harlow Plantation working in the house and gardens, but they would never be told the truth about their parentage. They would never be educated beyond basic tasks, and when the white daughters married and left the plantation, the black daughters would be willed to them as personal servants, bound to their half-sisters for life without ever knowing the true nature of the relationship. Sarah, Louisa, and Hannah accepted these terms because they had no real choice. The alternative was watching their daughters sold to unknown buyers, likely to face sexual exploitation or brutal field work in the Deep South's expanding cotton plantations. At least at Harlow Plantation, under Eleanor's control, their daughters would be relatively safe. It was a poisonous bargain, but in the world of American slavery, poisonous bargains were often the only form of protection available. Benjamin Harlow died in November 1849 at age 47. His will, preserved in county records, left equal portions of land and money to his 3 legitimate daughters. The 3 enslaved daughters were listed as property, each valued at $800 to be divided among the heirs. Their mothers received no mention beyond being listed in the inventory of enslaved people on the property. In death, as in life, Benjamin maintained the fiction that only his white daughters were his children. But in the slave quarters, the three mothers held a quiet vigil the night Benjamin was buried. They didn't mourn the man who had used them, who had fathered children he would never acknowledge, who had treated their daughters as property while lavishing education and privilege on their half-sisters. Instead, they mourned the impossible circumstances that had defined their lives, and they prayed that somehow, eventually, the truth would emerge from the shadows where men like Benjamin Harlow had tried to bury it. Chapter 4. The Price of Inheritance. Catherine Harlow married in 1851 at age 20 to Thomas Richardson, the son of a wealthy Charleston merchant family. The wedding was held at Harlow Plantation, a lavish affair with over 200 guests from the region's planter aristocracy. Among the gifts Catherine received was Sarah's daughter, now 19 years old, transferred from Eleanor's ownership to Catherine's as part of the marriage settlement. The girl, still identified in legal documents only as Sarah's girl, packed her few belongings and moved with Catherine to the Richardson estate outside Charleston. Elizabeth married in 1852 to William Barrett, a planter from Georgia. Louisa's daughter, then 18, was given to Elizabeth as a wedding gift. Margaret, the youngest white daughter, married in 1854. Hannah's daughter, age 18, became Margaret's property and moved with her to a plantation in Virginia. In a single stroke of carefully orchestrated marriages, Eleanor had permanently separated the three half-sisters from each other, ensuring they would live the rest of their lives in different states, never able to communicate or maintain the quiet bond they'd formed at Harlow Plantation. Sarah, Louisa, and Hannah remained at the now much quieter Harlow Plantation with Eleanor. The three women, now in their 40s, continued working as they had for decades, but something had shifted. The leverage they'd once held, the threat of revealing the truth, had diminished with Benjamin's death and their daughter's dispersal. Eleanor no longer needed their silence about past events. She needed their continued invisibility in a household now winding down. Letters Catherine wrote to her mother between 1851 and 1860, discovered in an attic trunk in 2019, revealed the white daughter's complete ignorance of the truth. Catherine's correspondence mentioned my girl Sarah frequently, noting that she was remarkably skilled at hairdressing and sewing, and that guests often commented on the servant's refined features. In one letter from 1855, Catherine wrote, "Several ladies have remarked that my girl Sarah bears a striking resemblance to our family. It must be coincidence, though it is curious. She serves me well and knows her place perfectly." The phrase "knows her place perfectly" carried sinister weight. It meant that Sarah's daughter had been successfully trained in the elaborate performance of invisibility that enslaved people in wealthy households were expected to maintain. She dressed her half-sister every morning, styled her hair, listened to her intimate conversations with her husband, cared for Catherine's children when they were born, and never once revealed that she was those children's aunt by blood. Elizabeth's letters to Eleanor, fewer but similarly preserved, mentioned Louisa's daughter less frequently, but noted that she was reliable and quiet, the highest compliments a slaveholder could give an enslaved person, meaning they caused no trouble and made no demands. Margaret's letters from Virginia, the least frequent of the three, barely mentioned Hannah's daughter at all, suggesting Margaret had absorbed the Southern aristocracy's view that enslaved people were essentially background elements of household management, unworthy of detailed mention. The three enslaved daughters lived their entire adult lives in this suspended state of identity. They had names. We know from census records after emancipation that Sarah's daughter was called Grace, Louisa's daughter was called Mary, and Hannah's daughter was called Ruth. But during their years of enslavement, they were identified primarily by their mother's names or by their roles: my girl, the maid, the seamstress. Their personhood had been so thoroughly erased from official records that reconstructing even basic biographical information about them requires piecing together fragments from multiple sources. Grace, working in the Richardson household in Charleston, witnessed the secession crisis and the beginning of the Civil War in 1861. As South Carolina became the first state to secede from the Union, Charleston was transformed into the Confederacy's symbolic capital. The Richardson family, like most of Charleston's elite, enthusiastically supported secession and the war to preserve slavery. Grace served dinners, where men discussed military strategy, and women organized fundraisers for Confederate soldiers. She dressed Catherine for balls where the cream of Charleston society celebrated the new nation they were building, a nation explicitly founded on the principle that people like Grace could never be equal to people like Catherine. The cruel irony was inescapable. Grace was helping her own half-sister prepare for events celebrating the continuation of the system that enslaved her. She fastened buttons on silk dresses while wearing rough homespun herself. She arranged Catherine's hair in elaborate styles while her own had to be covered with a simple cloth. She smiled and nodded while men toasted the Confederacy's future, knowing that future meant her own continued bondage. Mary, in Georgia with Elizabeth and William Barrett, experienced the war more directly. Georgia became a major battleground, especially after 1864 when Sherman's march to the sea devastated the state. The Barrett plantation was in the path of Sherman's advance. According to testimony Mary gave years later to researchers collecting formerly enslaved people's narratives in the 1930s, found in Library of Congress archives, Union soldiers arrived at the Barrett plantation in November 1864. Mary was 42 years old when Union troops reached the plantation. She described the moment as overwhelming. The soldiers told us we were free. I didn't understand at first. Free meant nothing to me. I'd never been anything but enslaved. But they said we could leave, could go anywhere we wanted. I looked at Miss Elizabeth, the woman I'd served my whole life, and for the first time I saw her see me, really see me. She looked frightened. She knew the world was changing. But Mary didn't leave immediately. Like many formerly enslaved people, she had nowhere to go, no money, no education that would help her survive in an economy collapsing around the war. She stayed at the Barrett plantation through the end of the war and into the chaos of early Reconstruction, working now for wages, minimal wages, but wages nonetheless. It wasn't until 1867 that she left, moving to Atlanta where she found work as a laundress. Ruth in Virginia with Margaret had a different experience. Virginia saw constant fighting throughout the war. The plantation where Ruth lived changed hands between Confederate and Union control multiple times. By 1865, the household was in ruins. Margaret's husband had died fighting for the Confederacy in 1863. Margaret, now a widow with 3 small children and a collapsed economy, couldn't maintain the plantation. She was forced to sell land and most of her possessions. According to family records preserved by Patricia Owens' descendants, Ruth stayed with Margaret after emancipation, not because she wanted to, but because Margaret begged her to. In a strange reversal, the white woman who had once owned Ruth now depended on her. Margaret had never learned to cook, clean, or manage a household without enslaved labor. Ruth, despite being free, found herself in a position where leaving would mean condemning her half-sister to probable starvation. She stayed, working for minimal compensation, until Margaret's oldest son was old enough to take over the household's management. Back at Harlow Plantation in South Carolina, Sarah, Louisa, and Hannah experienced liberation in 1865 when Union troops reached the area. They were 62, 58, and 55 years old respectively, elderly by the standards of the time, especially for women who had spent their lives in enslaved labor. Eleanor, now 73 and in poor health, remained at the plantation with minimal resources. The economic foundation of her world had collapsed. An extraordinary letter found in 2022 during the sale of a private collection revealed a remarkable moment. In June 1865, shortly after Confederate surrender, Sarah confronted Eleanor one final time. According to the letter Eleanor wrote to her daughter Catherine, Sarah told her, "I am free now. My daughter is free. But you stole 50 years of our lives. You knew what your husband did. You knew our daughters were his daughters. You knew they were sisters to your daughters, and you said nothing. You did worse than nothing. You made sure the truth stayed buried." Eleanor's letter to Catherine continued. "I was shaken by her boldness, but what could I say? The world has turned upside down. Everything we knew is gone. She is right that I knew, and I said nothing. I would do the same again to protect you and your sisters, but I cannot defend it to her, and I will not try." The 3 mothers, Sarah, Louisa, and Hannah, left Harlow Plantation in 1865. They moved to a nearby town where formerly enslaved people were establishing a community. Sarah lived until 1871, Louisa until 1873, Hannah until 1869. All 3 died without ever seeing their daughters again, separated by distance and the chaos of post-war Reconstruction. The quiet support network they'd formed, the shared understanding that had sustained them through decades of impossible circumstances, ended as they'd feared it might, with separation and silence. Grace, Mary, and Ruth, the 3 half-sisters, never reunited after the war. Grace remained in Charleston working as a seamstress. Mary lived in Atlanta, working as a laundress and later as a midwife. Ruth eventually moved to Richmond, working in domestic service. They were separated by hundreds of miles and had no way to find each other in an era before telephones or easy travel. More than that, they'd been deliberately kept ignorant of their true relationship to each other. They knew they'd grown up at the same plantation, knew they'd been close as children, but they didn't know they shared a father. Catherine, Elizabeth, and Margaret, the White half-sisters, struggled through Reconstruction and the post-war economic collapse of the South. Their wealth, built entirely on enslaved labor, evaporated. Catherine's letters from the 1870s and 1880s, preserved by her descendants, showed a woman unable to understand how her world had fallen apart. She blamed abolitionists, blamed Union soldiers, blamed formerly enslaved people who didn't know their place anymore. She never considered that the system she'd benefited from was fundamentally unjust, never questioned whether the women who had served her family might have been more than property. None of the three white sisters ever learned the truth about their black half-sisters. They died in the early 1900s, Catherine in 1903, Elizabeth in 1906, Margaret in 1901, never knowing that the women who had served them, who had dressed them and cooked for them and cared for their children, were their own blood relatives. The secret Eleanor and Benjamin had worked so hard to maintain succeeded in its primary goal. The White daughters never faced the social stigma of acknowledged black family members, but secrets have a way of surviving, even when people don't. The photograph from 1843 passed through Catherine's line, eventually reaching Rebecca Montgomery's grandmother. Grace's descendants preserved oral histories about the Harlow connection. Mary's family kept fragments of information about her origins. Ruth's descendants maintained stories about the Virginia plantation where she'd lived. None of these families knew about the others. None of them had the full picture. It would take DNA technology unimaginable to everyone involved in this story to finally connect the dots and reveal what Eleanor and Benjamin had tried so hard to hide. Chapter 5. Voices from the Grave. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source, a cache of letters hidden in the walls of the old Harlow Plantation Chapel during renovations in 2018. The chapel, built in 1835, had served as the plantation's worship space before falling into disrepair after the Civil War. A historical preservation society purchased the property in 2015 with plans to restore it. During structural assessment, workers discovered a hollow space behind interior wall panels. Inside were dozens of letters, carefully wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from moisture. The letters dated from 1835 to 1864, a 30-year correspondence between Eleanor Harlow and her sister Margaret Pemberton, who lived in Charleston. Unlike official documents or public-facing letters meant to project a certain image, these were private communications between sisters, written with the assumption no one else would ever read them. They revealed Eleanor's true thoughts about her husband's actions, her own role in maintaining the system, and her calculations about protecting her daughters. Dr. Jennifer Harris, a historian from the University of South Carolina, who was brought in to assess the letter's historical value, realized immediately what she was reading. "The first letter I opened," she said in an interview recorded in 2019, "was from 1840. Eleanor wrote to her sister about Benjamin's continued indiscretions and how she had reached an understanding with the women involved. My hands were shaking as I read. This wasn't a vague reference to something that might have happened. This was explicit acknowledgement of a system she had created." The letters laid bare Eleanor's mindset. In a letter from 1842, she wrote, "Margaret, you asked if I am troubled by the situation with the three women and their daughters. I confess I am not, at least not in the way you might imagine. Benjamin's weakness is the weakness of many men in his position. I cannot change that. What I can do is manage the consequences. The daughters born of these unions are my husband's children by blood, but they cannot be recognized as such without destroying our family's standing. So I have arranged matters to everyone's benefit. The mothers receive protections they would not otherwise have. Their daughters are kept near and treated well by the standards of their station, and my own daughters are shielded from scandal." Another letter from 1845 was even more chilling. "The girl who serves Catherine has grown to look remarkably like her. Several visitors have commented on the resemblance, always carefully, knowing it is dangerous ground. I smile and change the subject, but I am aware. I am always aware. I have trained the girls well. They understand that their comfort depends on silence. They will never speak of what they might suspect. And even if they did, who would believe an enslaved girl making such claims about a respectable white family? If this story has already gripped you, leave a like. It helps the story of these silenced families reach more people." Dr. Harris spent months analyzing the letters, cross-referencing them with other documents. She contacted Rebecca Montgomery, Angela Foster, and Patricia Owens, the three descendants who had already discovered their DNA connection. The letters provided the missing pieces of a puzzle they'd been struggling to solve, concrete proof that Eleanor not only knew about Benjamin's relationships with Sarah, Louisa, and Hannah, but had actively orchestrated the system that kept the resulting daughters in bondage while maintaining social respectability. The letters also revealed moments of doubt and guilt that Eleanor never expressed publicly. In a letter from 1855, 10 years before the end of slavery, she wrote, "Sometimes in the night I think about those girls, grown into women now, serving my daughters without knowing they are serving their own sisters. I tell myself I have done what was necessary to protect my family. But I wonder, Margaret, if God will judge me harshly for these arrangements. Benjamin is dead, and beyond judgment, but I continue the system he created. Is that better or worse? I do not know, and I do not allow myself to think about it too deeply." This was as close as Eleanor ever came to admitting moral culpability, but even in private, she couldn't bring herself to call the situation by its true name. Slavery, sexual abuse, the deliberate erasure of kinship. She used euphemisms, arrangements, Benjamin's weakness, the situation. The language softened the reality, allowed her to avoid confronting the full weight of what she had done. The letters also documented the surveillance system Eleanor maintained. She had informants among the enslaved population who reported conversations and behaviors to her. She knew when the three daughters asked their mothers questions about their fathers. She knew when they whispered together about the resemblances they saw between themselves and the white daughters. She knew, and she intervened, sometimes with subtle reminders about the consequences of speaking out of turn, sometimes with threats of being sold away or having already minimal privileges removed. One particularly disturbing letter from 1850 described an incident where Grace, Sarah's daughter, then 17, had asked her mother directly who her father was. Sarah, bound by her agreement with Eleanor, refused to answer. Grace persisted. Eleanor found out through her network of informants. She called Grace into her office and, according to the letter, told her, "Your father is of no concern to you. You were born into the station God appointed for you. Questions about parentage are dangerous and inappropriate. If I hear that you have raised this subject again with your mother or anyone else, you will be sent to work in the fields and you will not return to the house." Grace was silenced. The letter continued. The girl wept, but she understood. She has not raised the question again. I regret the necessity, but these matters must be managed firmly. Dr. Harris also discovered something else in the letters, evidence that Eleanor had falsified some official records. In a letter from 1851, Eleanor mentioned instructing the family lawyer to alter birth records to show different dates for the enslaved daughters, deliberately creating confusion about their exact ages and making it harder for anyone to notice the timing pattern that revealed they were born shortly after Benjamin's legitimate daughters. This was crucial evidence. It meant that official records, the very documents historians rely on to reconstruct the past, had been deliberately manipulated to hide the truth. Census records, property inventories, even church registers had been altered through Eleanor's influence and the complicity of local officials who valued their relationship with the powerful Harlow family more than they valued accuracy. The discovery of the letters energized the research project. Rebecca, Angela, and Patricia, now working with Dr. Harris and a team of genealogists, launched a comprehensive effort to find more evidence. They contacted descendants of other enslaved families from Harlow Plantation, visited archives in 3 states, and even used ground-penetrating radar to search the old plantation grounds for unmarked graves that might contain remains for DNA testing. In 2019, they found the grave of a woman buried near the slave quarters, marked only with rough stones. DNA extraction from teeth, one of the best sources for ancient DNA, revealed that the woman was Sarah, Grace's mother. She had died in 1871, and her body had been buried by the community of formerly enslaved people who had settled near the plantation. Her grave was simple and unmarked, with any permanent monument, reflecting both the poverty of the community and the desire to avoid drawing attention from hostile white residents during the violent years of Reconstruction. But Sarah's DNA provided a crucial link. It confirmed what the letters and oral histories had suggested. Grace was Sarah's daughter, and Grace's father was Benjamin Harlow. The DNA results, combined with the documentary evidence from Eleanor's letters, created an unassailable case. The 6 girls in the 1843 photograph were sisters, 3 acknowledged and 3 erased, all sharing the same father. The research team published their findings in 2020 in the journal American Historical Review. The article titled Silenced Kinship, DNA Evidence and Hidden Letters Reveal Parallel Families in an Antebellum Plantation became one of the most downloaded and cited papers in the journal's history. It wasn't just about one family. It was about a pattern that had occurred thousands of times across the slaveholding South, hidden in plain sight, documented in ways that only now, with DNA technology and careful historical research, could be definitively proven. The publication sparked intense reactions. Some descendants of the Harlow family, those descended from Catherine, Elizabeth, and Margaret's lines, were shocked and uncomfortable. Rebecca Montgomery described receiving angry phone calls from distant cousins who accused her of stirring up trouble and dishonoring family history. One relative told her, "Why couldn't you just leave this buried? Nothing good comes from digging up old scandals." But other white descendants reacted differently. Several contacted Rebecca to express gratitude for the truth, even though it was painful. One woman, a great-great-great-granddaughter of Elizabeth Harlow, wrote, "I always knew something was wrong with the family stories we told. They were too clean, too perfect. Real history isn't like that. Thank you for having the courage to uncover what really happened. My ancestor was complicit in terrible injustice, and I need to acknowledge that, not hide from it." The black descendants, Angela Foster, Patricia Owens, and others who had since connected with the research, described feeling vindicated. The oral histories their families had preserved for generations, often dismissed by historians as unreliable or exaggerated, turned out to be accurate. The whispers about Harlow blood and sisters separated weren't myths or confused memories. They were carefully preserved truths, passed down because the official records had been deliberately falsified. Angela Foster gave a speech at the 2021 unveiling of a historical marker at the site of the old Harlow plantation, preserved now by the Historical Society. She said, "For 150 years, my family told stories about our connection to this place and these people. We were told we were wrong, that we were exaggerating, that enslaved people's memories couldn't be trusted. But we were right. We remembered what they tried to make us forget. This marker doesn't change the past, but it acknowledges the truth. Grace, Mary, and Ruth were erased from history, treated as property instead of people, denied the right even to claim their own father. Today, we say their names and tell their story." The historical marker read, Harlow Plantation 1828-1865, site where Benjamin Harlow enslaved 87 people. Recent DNA evidence and historical documents revealed that Harlow fathered 6 daughters, 3 with his wife Eleanor, recognized as legitimate heirs, and 3 with enslaved women, Sarah, Louisa, and Hannah, whose daughters were kept in bondage as their half-sister's property. This site represents both the systemic sexual exploitation inherent in American slavery and the resilience of families who preserved truth despite deliberate erasure. The marker's installation was controversial. Local historical groups argued about the wording, about whether it was appropriate to include information about sexual exploitation at a site that might be visited by families. But the descendants, both black and white, insisted on honest language. The compromise was to include a warning sign about potentially disturbing historical content, but to keep the marker's text unaltered. Eleanor's letters, meanwhile, were donated to the South Carolina Historical Society's archives, where they're now available to researchers. They've become a crucial source for historians studying not just slavery, but the specific mechanisms by which white women in slaveholding families maintained systems of exploitation and erasure. Eleanor's voice, calculating, self-justifying, occasionally guilt-ridden but never guilt-ridden enough to change her actions, provided a rare window into the mindset of a woman who was simultaneously a victim of patriarchy and an architect of racial oppression. Dr. Harris published a book in 2023, The Harlow Sisters, Race, Kinship, and Memory in American Slavery, which used the Harlow case as a lens for examining larger patterns. The book became a bestseller and was adapted into a documentary film in 2024. The film used the 1843 photograph as its central image, slowly zooming in on each girl's face while descendants narrated what they had learned about their ancestors. The photograph that had been hidden in an attic for generations, passed down as a curious relic of the past, became one of the most powerful visual documents of American slavery. It showed what everyone knew but rarely admitted, the blood relationships that slavery tried to erase, the families torn apart not just by sale, but by the deliberate denial of kinship, the sisters who grew up together but could never acknowledge each other. Chapter 6. The Children Who Never Knew. The most painful aspect of the Harlow story wasn't just what happened to Grace, Mary, and Ruth during their lifetimes, but what happened to their children and grandchildren, generations who grew up not knowing they had white relatives, not knowing the full story of their family's origins, not knowing that they carried the DNA of a man who had enslaved their ancestors. Grace, after emancipation, married a man named Thomas Freeman in Charleston in 1867. She was 35 years old, considered relatively old for a first marriage at the time. Thomas was a carpenter, a formerly enslaved man who had taught himself the trade and was working to establish a business in Charleston's growing African-American community. Grace and Thomas had 4 children between 1868 and 1875. Grace worked as a seamstress, using skills she had learned while enslaved and while serving Catherine Harlow Richardson. According to family records preserved by Angela Foster's line, Grace never told her children the full truth about their heritage. She told them she had been enslaved at Harlow Plantation, that she had served in the Big House, that she had been freed by the Civil War. But she never told them about Benjamin Harlow being her father. She never told them that the white family she had served included her own half-sisters. She kept Eleanor's secret, even after Eleanor died in 1878. Why did Grace maintain the silence? We can't know for certain. She left no written account of her reasoning, but oral histories suggest she feared the consequences. During Reconstruction, and especially during the violent backlash of the Redemption period in the 1870s and 1880s, claiming kinship with white families could be dangerous. It could lead to accusations of uppity behavior, could invite violence from white supremacist groups, could make her family targets. Silence, again, was survival, but the silence came at a cost. Grace's children grew up not knowing half of their genetic heritage. When medical issues emerged in later generations, a genetic condition that turned out to be inherited from the Harlow line, doctors had no family history to work with. When Grace's grandchildren asked about their origins, they received incomplete answers. The full story was locked away, accessible only to Grace and eventually buried with her when she died in 1901. Mary's experience after emancipation was different. She had stayed in Georgia, living in Atlanta where she established herself as a midwife. Mary never married, which was unusual for the time but not unheard of among formerly enslaved women who had experienced trauma. She did, however, adopt 2 orphaned children in the 1870s, children whose parents had died during a yellow fever epidemic. She raised them as her own, teaching them the skills she knew: reading, sewing, basic medicine. Family oral histories preserved by Patricia Owens' line suggest that Mary told the adopted children a bit more than Grace had told her biological children. She told them she had a white father who had enslaved her mother. She told them she had half-sisters who were white, who had owned her. She told them the system was designed to separate families and erase kinship, but she never gave specific names, never identified the Harlow family directly. It was truth wrapped in protective vagueness, enough to help the children understand the complexity of their heritage without exposing them to specific dangers. One of Mary's adopted daughters, named Ruth after Hannah's daughter, became a teacher in Atlanta's African-American schools during the 1890s and early 1900s. She passed down Mary's stories to her own students, always framing them as examples of the hidden violence and family separation inherent in slavery. Ruth taught her students that African-American families often had white ancestry that was never acknowledged, that the history books lied about the reality of slavery, that truth was something they would have to fight to preserve and uncover. Hannah's daughter Ruth, the original Ruth, had perhaps the most complicated post-emancipation experience. She had stayed with Margaret Harlow in Virginia until Margaret's son took over the household in the mid-1870s. Ruth then moved to Richmond, where she found work in domestic service with another white family. She married in 1878, at age 40, to a man named James Morrison, a blacksmith. They had 2 children, both daughters. According to family records, Ruth told her daughters more direct truth than either Grace or Mary had told their children. She told them that her father had been Benjamin Harlow, that she had half-sisters who were white, that she had spent her entire childhood and youth serving her own sisters without them knowing. She told them she had watched Margaret Harlow struggle after emancipation, had stayed with her out of what she described as complicated feelings I cannot fully explain, and had eventually left because she needed to build her own life. Ruth's daughters asked why she had stayed with Margaret after gaining freedom. Ruth's answer, preserved in family oral history, was striking. She was my sister. I never got to claim her as that, and she never knew it, but I knew. When she was struggling, when her husband was dead and her children were hungry, I couldn't just walk away. It wasn't about forgiveness. I don't know that I ever forgave what was done to me and my mother. It was about not wanting to become the kind of person who abandons family, even family that doesn't know their family. This raised complex questions about loyalty, kinship, and survival that descendants are still grappling with today. Was Ruth's decision to stay with Margaret an act of extraordinary compassion, or was it another form of victimization? The psychological residue of a lifetime being trained to put her half-sister's needs before her own. Different descendants interpret it differently, and there may not be a single correct answer. The grandchildren of Grace, Mary, and Ruth grew up in a rapidly changing and violently contested America. They lived through Jim Crow segregation, through the Great Migration North, through the Civil Rights Movement. Many moved away from the South, seeking better opportunities and escape from racial violence. In the process, family stories became fragmented. Some lines preserved more information than others. Some families kept careful records. Others lost track of their history in the chaos of forced migration and economic survival. Angela Foster's great-grandmother, Grace's granddaughter, moved to Philadelphia in 1920 during the Great Migration. She took with her a small trunk containing family documents, including the photograph of Grace that matched the one in the 1843 group portrait. She told her daughter, "This is your great-grandmother. She was enslaved, but she was also more than that. She had a father who was white, who was her master. She had sisters who were white, who owned her. Remember this. Don't let anyone tell you our family history is simple or easy to understand. It's complicated, and that complication is part of American history." Patricia Owen's grandmother, Mary's adopted granddaughter, stayed in Georgia through the Jim Crow era. She became involved in the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s, drawing direct connections between her family's history of slavery and the ongoing struggle for equality. She taught her children and grandchildren, the white people who say they're not responsible for slavery because their ancestors didn't own slaves are lying or ignorant. Most of them are descended from slaveholders, and more than that, many African Americans carry DNA from those same slaveholding families. We're all connected by the violence of the past, and we can't heal until we acknowledge the connections. The descendants who carried Harlow DNA without knowing it lived their entire lives not understanding part of their own genetic heritage. When genetic testing became commercially available in the early 2000s, some descendants took tests for genealogical curiosity. The results often showed higher percentages of European ancestry than expected, and specific genetic markers that indicated ancestry from the British Isles, consistent with the Harlow family's origins in England several generations before Benjamin. But without context, these results were just data points. They didn't tell the story behind the numbers. They didn't explain how that European DNA got there, under what circumstances, with what violence or exploitation. They certainly didn't reveal that descendants of enslaved women had half-sisters who were white, whose descendants might be living in the same cities, completely unaware of the connection. The 2015-2016 DNA connections between Rebecca, Angela, and Patricia changed everything. Suddenly the data had context. Suddenly the numbers in genetic reports connected to specific people, specific stories, specific violence. Suddenly descendants could understand not just that they had mixed ancestry, many Americans do, but exactly how and why and under what circumstances. For the white descendants, the revelation was often uncomfortable. Many had grown up with family stories that sanitized the past, that portrayed their ancestors as kind slave owners, or that avoided discussing slavery altogether. Learning that their ancestors had not just owned people, but had fathered children with enslaved women, then kept those children in bondage, was disturbing. Some refused to accept it, insisting the DNA tests must be wrong, or that the historians had misinterpreted the documents. But others accepted the truth and grappled with what it meant. Rebecca Montgomery became an advocate for honest historical education. She gave talks at schools and community centers about her family's history, about the ways white families benefited from slavery, and about the ongoing responsibility to acknowledge that past. She received both praise and criticism, with some people thanking her for her honesty and others accusing her of self-hatred or white guilt. For the black descendants, the revelation was often validating. The family stories they'd been told, sometimes dismissed as exaggerated or unreliable by historians and even by other family members, turned out to be true. The whispers about white ancestry weren't vague rumors but specific, documentable facts. The sense of having been erased from history was real, and now they had proof. But validation came with its own challenges. Some descendants struggled with what to do with the information. Did claiming Harlow ancestry mean claiming kinship with people whose ancestors had enslaved their ancestors? Did it mean forgiving the violence of the past? Did it mean something about their own identity that they weren't comfortable with?